Welcome to Discover the Difference, a podcast brought to you by C3. I'm your host, Jamie Reed, and along with Gabe, we have two very special guests today. Former CIA operatives who were also chief of staffs in their respective countries, in Mark Davidson and Ralph Goff. Now, along these two, we have a special co-host and our friend Blake Stevens, who is with the leadership team of Alder. Blake and I spent time in Ukraine during the war with Mark Davidson. He brings in Ralph, one of his close friends and mentors from the CIA, and we hit on topics like curiosity, creativity, the rising role of women in the workplace, all topics that are important to how the CIA operates around the world, but also that are very key to how we operate in the business world. You're gonna love this episode of Discover the Difference. All right, Ralph, Mark, thanks so much for coming in today. We're going to open with each of you taking 3-4 minutes, kind of give us a compressed version of story of life to your journey into the CIA. But first, I want to share the story that I kind of teased on the preamble. I was looking at this picture of Mark before we went to Ukraine together, and I was like, man, this guy just looks like a gnarly, hard-ass CIA guy. So intimidating looking in your black and white picture. And then fast forward to that, we're in that amazing restaurant. It was just the coolest setting. I sit down next to you, and we're having a conversation, and I'm like, this guy's a pretty nice guy. I just assumed you were part of Alder with us, and we were all having dinner. I was amazed because you just met me at my level of intellect, which is pretty low. And then Davidson gets to a point where he's like, okay, we're gonna, get to our keynote here, and he's gonna kick us off. And then you start talking, and I'm like, wait a minute, this is the guy? And you just started speaking, and I was like, dang, this guy is super duper impressive. And your intellect just blew me away at how you can make it consumable. And I thought the business takeaway was really like being able to meet people where they're at, communicate at their level. And I don't know how they do it with you guys, but I'm just guessing that is a refined skill with the CIA. So maybe we turn it over to you and give us a soundbite on how you got to arrive at that place.
Yeah, by the way, we thought Jamie texts me and says, I'm sitting next to Jason Bourne.
I'd love to roll with that. I really wish we could, right? No jumping out of planes, and I appreciate that's really kind of you along the way. I mean, I'll maybe come to the last thing you sort of said about like skill set. I think people who sign up for a career in intelligence or in operations, they probably have a little bit of innate facility or an interest of meeting people where they're at, because you have to be able to engage with so many different communities, right? And that can be bad guys or a terrorist, or it can be accomplished diplomats or things like that. So you do get a little practice. You learn from others before you what was really good. Bringing that back to your question about my background, I think a little bit of that in my story was a little bit of a romantic, right? So I'm a Chicago kid. I grew up in it's suburbs of Chicago now. When I was young, it was kind of farming community in there. I'm a Cold War kid. I'm old enough to have remembered the under your desk, nuclear fallout drills, things like that. I was a big reader. So I was a real fan of the Le Carre novels and everything about Cold War espionage. So I go on to school, I go to college, I did a PhD program in American literature. I really liked,
You're keeping with that burly, tough guy.
That's right. Exactly. I started building it up, So for me, I played sports and I read books, and I really liked that. And I watched some movies and things like that. But I was fascinated with that culture and the hockey part of it. So playing ice hockey at a young age, I was able to go to places like behind the Iron Curtain. I played in Belarus and in Russia and different things like that as part of programs from the U.S. And I realized the world was pretty big, right? So, but you're still going out, you're sorting it out. I get through graduate school, I get a first job teaching, literature and fiction, and it was really cool, but it was super boring, right? And I realized I like books, and books go with me anywhere. I don't have to do this for a living. What I really want to do is I want to try and join the CIA. I want to try and be a spy. And a story for a separate podcast. By hook and crook, I get a conversation, I meet some people, I go through the interview process, and then I landed there. And 22 years later, I retired. It's an amazing career, it's an amazing journey for me. It took me to a lot of great places. You get to have, and Ralph can talk about it, for many operations officers, that first half of your career, secret squirrel stuff. And that's where you're really doing the cool stuff that you think about. And then the latter part of it is you're a leader, you're a manager, you're developing younger officers, you're doing things like that. In my case, I served in a few places that faced crisis and revolution and a lot of challenges. And I learned a lot.
Coincidental.
That's right. Right. I'm not sure which is the cart and which is the horse on that one, but I did learn, and I grew to really like the challenges of navigating that. So when I was looking for a new opportunity at the end of my agency career, I was really fortunate to land at the Starbucks Coffee Company, helping them develop and lead their global intelligence, their crisis management, and their business continuity programs, and eventually executive protection, which took a lot of that same problem-solving ideas and critical thinking that goes into intelligence operations, planning, preparation, putting people in the right places, articulating through crisis, and leading people, and tried that in a corporate sector. And that I'd been doing that for the last 6 years. I sort of reached the point in that one where I think things were working really well. It ultimately, it's a coffee company, right? They're about the coffee. I wanted to do some more things, so I moved into consulting. So now I'm doing some for myself, and I work with the Concentric group, leading their growth and strategy, which provides a lot of security consulting services for family offices, corporations, high net worth individuals. So that's kind of my story. So we hear
There's a lot to dig into that.
Yeah,
We'll have to get into it. But was that ever a cover as a professor in literature in your career?
No, not at all. Right. Not at all. Partly, cover, and you get to that. Cover is generally something that allows you to do the things that are important to do. So academic, if the White House needed to know about a Marxist interpretation of Faulkner, that would be a good cover. Otherwise, that's not really where you want to be too long. So fortunately, there's also some really good and important rules about that stuff, despite popular media and reporting. There's some really good, strict, and honest limitations on what intelligence organizations do with things like journalism and religious organizations, educational ones as well, because we don't want to taint the good work of those programs or doing it by things that are ultimately operational on behalf of national security.
Well, Gabe's right. I have several questions that I'm going to retain for a minute, so then we can shift to Ralph. And if you'll give us your background leading up to the CIA as well.
Sure, my pleasure. Look, no romance in my story like Mark's, but I'm a few years older than him. I was a Cold Warrior. Yeah, as an 18-year-old kid, I was I was a soldier in the U.S. Army on the East-West German border. I grew up in Connecticut. My mom was German, and I think that had an effect on me, opening my eyes to the world outside New England, particularly after being the only kid to wear lederhosen to school for the first day of first grade in 1966. That was a really fun day. So,
You're really accepted by the way.
yeah. So as I went through school, I actually wanted to be a forest ranger, but my parents couldn't afford college, and I was a poor student in high school, so I went into the Army. And an enterprising recruiter found out that I had, where I lacked math aptitude, I had good language aptitude. So he put me into a slot where I learned Russian in the U.S. Army, and they sent me overseas. And I served 4 years, which I then traded for 4 years of the GI Bill to go through college, University of Connecticut, go Huskies. And then I had every intention of going back into the service, but one day I got a phone call and I got diverted into government work. And I worked first I worked at the National Security Agency as an analyst. I was a horrible analyst. And then I tried my luck at State Department a little bit, and then finally ended up in the agency where I spent 35 years. I was what they call a chief of station 6 times, which is not a record, but is pretty unusual and fun. And usually the chief of station is the person who is the lead U.S. intelligence representative in the country they're posted. In movies, he's the guy who always cancels the helicopter at the last minute to rescue the hero. So luckily, I never had to do that. But it was a great career. I wouldn't trade a moment of it in either the good days or the bad days. I finally retired after a tour in the Middle East, and I'm doing my own consulting thing with some projects in Ukraine, Slava Ukraini. And now I'm here talking to you guys.
Well, there was a couple words there that were dropped that were questions that were kind of hanging in my mind anyhow. So I want to go back to Mark. You use the word romance because I think that's what a lot of people think of when they think CIA. And I don't know if Jason Bourne was a CIA guy or not, but it's that romantic feeling about what is being done. And then you reference coming through the military to it. I think a lot of the CIA individuals we interact with have a military background, and for obvious reasons that aligns well, but you took a different path. Like, how did that frame up?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's not lost on me. It's so many of my colleagues have come from military backgrounds. I think, and I don't know that I can attribute this to myself when I started, but I think there's an element of people who sometimes succeed in the intelligence community and CIA are people who like to try and do hard things, right? And they want to be creative and they want to do problem solving and they want to do something that if it was easy to do, you wouldn't need the existence of an agency. Our State Department foreign policy colleagues do amazing things, right? And we're there for the things that they need to work on, but they just don't know, right? So it's a hard problem set. It requires creativity. It requires being skeptical of inherited wisdom, and it requires sort of an operational problem solving approach. And I do think I had a bit of that, particularly the creative part. I had some of those attributes that would allow me to be successful. And you touched on it easier, like you called it meeting people where they are. It gets overused now, but the idea of soft skills, right? Like I was really curious. Like I was as interested in when I was working plumbers, assistant contracting jobs. I loved talking to those guys. I'd be digging the trench and I'd be listening to their banter and I'd be learning from that. And then meanwhile, I'd have the opportunity to be around a business executive and talking to them and sort of meeting them where they're at and sort of learning from them. You get to do all of that in the agency. And I think I was so eager and enthusiastic for it that it allowed me to have success, right? And the more refined the operations are, the more challenging it is, the more specific the skill set is, the more deep work that goes into it. And that was a place where I could sort of thrive. And sometimes to an advantage of somebody from a military background where it's regimented, I didn't have that performative experience that was so successful in many places. I wasn't encumbered by it. I could take it on fresh. I could dive deep. I could come up with a completely new solution because I didn't have an inherited skill set the way like Ralph's leadership skills. And I worked for Ralph. I've followed him in roles. He's one of the finest leaders I've known anywhere at any time. And I think some of that, I've known him for 17, 18 years now. Some of it is how Ralph was wired, but a lot of it is also things that, he picked up over time. Ralph said to me about a boss that we both worked for. He said, I learned a lot from him. And I also learned what I'm not from him. And I thought that was really good, right? People can be super effective. And you could say, Jamie, you're amazing in this situation, but I'm not you. I can't do it the same way. But I saw where you got, and I got to figure out my own way to get there. And I think the agency is a benefit of having sort of diverse sort of approaches to some of the problems.
It's interesting, that you talk about curiosity, as something that's really helped you in your career. It's something that we talk about a lot in the business world. And it really comes to, the curiosity comes to listening and really being able to, understand what's happening around you. Maybe you guys could talk a little bit about how curiosity, example, something from your time in the agency where it's really, it's something that really helped you, or a little story around that.
Curiosity, actually, that's a great trait for any case officer. Self-awareness is another one. You just said the word listening, and Mark and I can both think of many colleagues we've worked with who that was one of their poorer skills, and it made them less successful case officers. Right? You have to know when to talk and when to listen. And curiosity, that's where you're not turned off by a problem. You're attracted to it. I mean, what we deal with, it's human intelligence, human beings, right? So you're dealing with all the complications and frailties and vulnerabilities. That's a word we use a lot in intelligence. And you're also looking for strengths, and you're looking for capabilities, right? And we're often known in the intelligence world, human is known, or I should say intelligence is known as the third option, right? The president and the policymakers, they have really three main policy options. One is diplomacy, and then you have the military, and then in this kind of gray world between the two, sometimes is intelligence, the third option, right? Particularly when you talk about covert action, which is, in Hollywood likes to portray that as just overthrowing governments or, doing bad deeds, but really covert action is a tool that a president and his policy apparatus can fit in with the rest of their policy, right? Covert action should never be the policy, right? And so curiosity comes in when you're looking at the larger, or I should say the higher level of strategy is like, okay, what is our government trying to achieve here, right? Do they really want to overthrow the Milosevic government, or do they just want to warn them? Are they looking to stop. For instance, I spent a lot of time in the Balkans, and it's like, are they looking to arrest war criminals? Are they looking to stop genocide, right? Are these, how does that fit into the larger policy of the Balkans as well? So you have to be curious about these higher aspects while you're also curious about the people that you're going to target for recruitment, so that you can break these problems down and solve them.
How important or how certain are you about what the outcome is you're trying to achieve? Meaning you reference, what the government is trying to achieve as an outcome. Are you 100% of the time that you're collecting intelligence, are you 100% certain of what the outcome is trying to be achieved, or are you flying blinds much of the time?
Yeah, maybe I'll recast that in a way that helps me answer it a little bit better. So I think really good intelligence operations, and this really started early on in my career, are driven by requirements, right? It's driven by the need to know something. There was a glory day that I wish I'd been experiencing in the agency in the 70s and 80s, where you could develop a relationship with the Guatemalan second Secretary of Agriculture and get secrets from him because you could. But in the end, nobody cared, right? Nobody needed to know. And then that started transitioning wisely to, here's what we need to know. This is the question. This is the gap that we have. So then to your other part of your question, then I think what comes is you get to the intel community and there's a hypothesis, right? There's a hypothesis of what likelihoods we think are out there. And then you sort of break it down in the idea of like, well, how can we figure that out for certain? Who's the person or the organization that will have insights on that? How do we engage with them? How do we find a relationship with them? How do we construct a conversation that allows us to answer those questions? So you sort of move on to that. And so there's unknowns, but it generally starts with a hypothesis, right? If there's only 5 people who have access to a building, and you want to know what's in the building, you can take a lot of pictures of the building. You're better off figuring out who are these 5 people who go in and out of there, and how can we find a way to intersect with them or have a conversation with them? What can we learn about them? If eventually you learn that all of them studied biochemistry as undergrads 20 years ago in different countries, you're like, well, that's a clue, right? Yeah, so there's something going on there. So then it's like, well, one of them, their kid plays water polo, right? And then they've got to do that. So I'm a water polo fan. I'm going to go to every game for a while, right? Until you run across them. So I think it's always sort of unknowns, but it's not uninformed, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great question. Maybe could you talk us through, does the CIA tap you on the shoulder? Like if you're at the State Department, are they profiling you and tapping you on the shoulder?
Like work out. They tapped you on the shoulder and said, "Come over."
For the old days, they kind of did, right? In the old days, some of the guys I worked for told me interesting stories of how they were, at an Ivy League school, and a certain professor tapped them on the shoulder one day and handed them a phone number and an address and said, "Talk to these guys," right? Well, now, it's a website, right? And frankly, people log on to a secure website and begin the application process that way.
So they didn't say, Russian and German, you'd be a great candidate.
I wish I could say the government was that efficient, but it's not. Shocker. But, there are referrals. For instance, like when Mark and I are overseas in our posts, I can remember, for instance, serving in Afghanistan and working with our paramilitary officers. These are case officers who also have great skills, great military skills for, when you're in a dangerous place surrounded by the Taliban, you've got to have an extra set of skills there to survive. And we were always on the lookout with our military colleagues. Hey, here's a guy who's like, thinking of retiring or leaving the military, speaks Urdu or Pashtun, is really, has his stuff together, or she, right? Some of the best case officers we have are women, right? The case officer field is not a gender-specific profession, right? And so we're always looking for talent, and then you can make referrals. So there are ways for insiders who are already in to find talent and bring it in the door that way.
Yeah, he brought up an interesting. Were you going to riff on women?
No, go ahead.
Well, it's interesting because the rest of the world, or a lot of the other world, women are not viewed as equal as they are in the United States. I'm curious, does that become a weapon in the CIA to leverage in those countries?
So you may have read, so I write this occasional column called Chalk Marks. And one of the things I point out there is our superpower as the U.S. National Security Intelligence Agency is our female professionals, right? Because, and people have traveled around the world, like we're not perfect, and there's a lot of things that continue to improve here, but the ability to give women the opportunity to excel in some of these male-dominated security spaces is uniquely in the U.S. So we have female professionals. I think there was very few points in my career where I wasn't reporting to a female leader, and somewhere along my chain, I had a fantastic ones. And let me tell you, if you're looking for somebody to do an undercover secret squirrel operation behind the Iron Curtain or in the Middle East or doing things like that, the local security forces just don't think at first glance to think about female professionals. So we kill them with that. So again, there's a lot that could be
It is
said.
the women bias against them.
100%, right? Like, this is, just think of it. If you were on the Whole Foods run and for some reason you thought you might be getting surveillance for any sort of reason, I guarantee you every dude in a hoodie would look super shady to you. You will not be noticing the mom with a pram. You will not be noticing the young woman in yoga pants. Like, you won't be noticing the woman in a professional business suit. We are not wired that way. And if you think that's the case here, it's definitely that case overseas. So yes, it is our superpower.
And for women too, let me add on there. It's harder for them because obviously there's the whole sex thing that pops out, right? Contrary to the movies, we do not seduce our agents, right?
I've been trying for years.
I had to counsel Mark on that a couple of times.
He counseled me because
It's HR stuff. See, they have the HR.
if I had success, he'd have been different about it.
But, the female case officers, because, like, let's face it, they're in some, third world country and they're showing interest in a male, right? And that male, what do you think the first thought that goes to their mind? She's digging me, right? So they have to get beyond that. And not only do they have to get beyond that, but they have to convince this person that, okay, you and I are going to have a special relationship where you're going to provide me with sensitive information from your government or from your military or what have you. And, that's not easy. And yet, the women and the female case officers in the agency do that every day in every country of the world. They're the best.
That's a great point. You guys talked about this being the sense of service. I think is the question. We think about it in the military, the sense of service, and also I think it definitely applies here. And there's a lot of people around you that sacrifice. Probably also benefit. So could you talk about your own families, how they, they've traveled the world with you.
Yeah.
They've probably, moved around a lot. And what that experience has been like for you and for them and that sacrifice.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to talk about this. I will say, I'll start up top. Like, people are very kind to retirees, recent retirees, particularly like Ralph and I will say, thank you for your service. And I never know what to do with that, because I do think that's a great sentiment, particularly for Private Snuffy, who grounded out at post in a really hot location for decades in the sand or whatever. Those folks deserve their thanks. I feel like it was a privilege. I should be thanking people every day that allowed me to go do that, because it really was an honor and a privilege. So in my case, in my family, probably relevant to this. So I am married 30 years as of January, and my wife joined the agency as well after I had started my career. She'd been a practicing attorney. And so she did over 2 decades as an intelligence officer, the director of operations as well. So we sort of did that together, and we raised 2 kids, right? I'd say they're 2 adults now. My youngest is a senior in high school, and my daughter is a junior in college. And they very much, I think, recognize the uniqueness of their lifestyle. So when I retire in 2019 and come back, I've got a high schooler and a middle schooler, and my daughter was like, full stop. I am a third culture kid. They'd never gone to school in the States. They'd never lived in the United States for more than a summer at a time. She's like, I am not wired for an American public high school. And that was probably the right call for her. So we figure it out. She goes to boarding school, and now she goes to the University of Washington. She's thriving. My son, meanwhile, who grew over and really enjoyed this, he wanted to be on a little league team. He wanted to do sleepovers. He wanted to ride his bike. He wanted Americana. He was like, he watched Stranger Things. It was like, what are those kids? Wait, they all walk into each other's houses. There's no security gates. He wanted that. And so we got him that. And then he really thrived on that and graduating through it. We used to sort of joke that we might never get our daughter back within 30 miles of us, and we might never get our son 30 miles away. But after a few years, that really changed. Like, now that they're back to it, they're comfortable when they're in motion. They're comfortable traveling. They know it's a big world. They like it. It's not without challenges. It's not for every kid. That is, moving every 3 years. you're also, attached to your parents and the risk profiles and their travels. And so it's complicated, but it's also wonderful.
Yeah. And the sacrifices, by the way, are made by the families, not by the officers. We love what we're doing, right? We voluntarily go to these horrible places, right? We voluntarily work on holidays, and we miss birthdays, and we miss weddings and funerals and gatherings. And I got buddies from the University of Connecticut. They go every year to the Big East, right? 30 some odd years they go to the Big East in Manhattan, and I made like maybe 10 of them over the 30 years, right? So each one was special for me. But the sacrifices of the friends and family outside your network, and officers, we would gladly do it, and we'd do it again.
Did you ever have any fears for their safety or experiences where you're like, what's going on here?
So my daughter will say that she thinks she's the only person who's been evacuated from 3 different countries at 3 different. I don't think she's entirely accurate on that, but her fact set is a true one for her. And again, even that being saying, a lot of that's preventive. A lot of that is being thoughtful and sort of moving away from that location. But they have, and in their case, particularly traumatic terrorist activity impacted kids at their schools. They went to school on a Friday, left things in their locker, didn't go back to school on Monday, and by Thursday they're out of the country and never went back. And so particularly for my older daughter, middle school age, if you guys have ever raised middle school daughters, I'm with you. Let's go. It's so hard. I wouldn't be a 13-year-old girl for anything in the world, right? So you're in your space, you got it sorted out. Yeah, that's probably for the best. And then all of a sudden you even get to say goodbye. Like a chapter of their life sort of closed at that time. It was tremendously hard. They developed tremendous resilience from this. But, so there's those challenges, the sacrifices Ralph talks about, but we don't really put them in physical danger. And those places, when we've gone to those war zone areas, we go unaccompanied and our families are in a safe situation, and then we go do that.
Although there are some countries, I served in one country where, due to the local building codes, you had bomb shelters in your houses there, right? Due to the frequency of outbreak of war and violence. And I remember I would advise my officers before they came out, said, tell your others, in the family, that you have a bomb shelter in your house, right? The day you move in at post is not the day for, your spouse, significant other to find out that you have a bomb shelter in the house, right? They say, oh, great, we got 3 bedrooms, and what's this room for, right? Why does it have, a steel shutter, and why is there an extra line for air and stuff like that, right? It's a bomb shelter, and you have some people say, okay, I'm done, see you, bye, have a great tour. No, we do have some places where our families that are at risk, but luckily the American government, the safety of our employees and the safety of our families particularly comes first. And so we have a whole process for figuring out what level of danger exists in a country and getting people out. But, I can imagine in Mark's case, when you have your kids and you have to evacuate them, it's a tough thing to do.
You also have to remember to train the 7-year-old that big emergency evacuation button that's on the wall like a doorbell. Don't push that, right? Because then it sends people in after consecutive times. They don't appreciate it.
I remember you telling a story about this idea of like this honor among spies, where you felt like, I don't know if you're able to tell it on this.
Yeah, I could sort of. So this is one of those Russian-speaking places that's particularly hostile sometimes for American intelligence professionals. So I was there, and my daughter was a toddler, and you would get surveillance on a regular basis. And there is an honor among spies generally in these sorts of situations. You pretend you don't see them, and they pretend they don't see you, and then you move around your life with a little train behind you. So if anybody's ever bought kids' clothes in a kids' clothing store, they got the circle of clothes and the jackets. Kids love to stand inside there, buying a snowsuit. Kids in there, we're looking at snowsuits, going around, and then we pick out a snowsuit, and there's no kid in there anymore. And so you look around, and we're at a big shopping complex, and we can't find the kid. We're walking through the store. We can't find Piper. Eventually, we realize she must have gotten out of the store. This is one of these malls that had a little playground down the way that was a frequent stop. So I start working down it, and then I see my surveillance team very gently corralling her as she's trying to make her way to this playground, like filtering her away, making sure she's safe, didn't go anywhere. And so I finally sort of catch up. I sort of nod in no direction of anyone. Thank you. They all nod in no direction of everybody else. I scoop up my kid and go back.
The surveillance team is not your surveillance team.
No,
The people that are surveillancing you.
Yes, exactly. I'm sorry. Better said. That was the team designated, and they were fairly familiar faces at this point in time, and so you would recognize them. But yeah, there was that idea that their job wasn't about me losing my kid, and I recognized their job wasn't about doing harm to the kid. So you do that. I'll be honest. I don't know Ralph's thought on that. That's changed a little bit. Like it's a little grittier out there. This was still a little bit of honor among spies, and I think. Probably to the health of no one, that's gone away to a certain degree. I'm not sure anybody would allow my 2-year-old to get in trouble, to be honest with you. There's still some humanity in the world, but it's a lot less than it used to be.
Ralph, as you take that cue from Mark there, I think when we had dinner and you explained that last time we were together, I think you set up what I might be using the wrong phrase here, but a known operative versus not being known. Like Russia knew you were there, right? Could you explain that?
We call that declared versus undeclared.
Declare.
And for instance, like early in our career, Mark and I would do tours where, we're not declared as CIA officers to the host country government, and then so that we can operate under whatever cover. And then gradually as your cover wears away, and some of our old bosses used to say, if your cover works, you don't, so a little harsh sometimes, but as you go through the system, you become known to more and more services. For instance, in my case, when I fill out forms for a security clearance update, they say, list any services that know that you're CIA, and it takes about an hour because it's literally like every service in the world, particularly because one service saw fit to out me on the internet after an incident to get back at me for something. But, declared officers, you're known, you meet with the government, and you're the lead representative of U.S. intelligence, and it's almost like you're it's like intelligence diplomacy,
Like a CIA ambassador?
yeah,
Well,
sort of, yeah. But you're also, the fun part is you're also probably running some unilateral officers who are not declared, and you're taking it to the government that doesn't is also looking to find out what you're doing against them as well. So it's a little bit of spy versus spy behind the scenes there. And let me clarify that, Mark and I, we are not spies, right? We're intelligence officers, we're case officers, and we recruit people who are spies, are agents, right? We're not agents either, we're case officers. And Hollywood tends to get that wrong because it sounds cooler, but, the real spies and the people that we recruit who provide the intelligence for whatever reason, right? The best ones are the ones who agree to cooperate with us based on ideology, particularly during the Cold War. A lot of brave souls from the Soviet Union and other hostile countries came over and worked for us because they believed in, the freedom of the West and democracy. And a lot of them paid for it with their lives. Right? A lot of them paid for it with prison terms. A lot of them paid for it with destroyed family lives. Right? And, so there is a human element there. It's fun to talk about spy versus spy, but there's a real human element there. And in fact, at CIA headquarters, we have a wall with the stars. Everyone sees that in the newspaper about the memorial stars. But a few years ago, one of our senior officers also said, hey, where's a memorial to our spies, to our foreign agents? So they actually created a new monument for the men and women who suffered as they labored as spies for American intelligence overseas. So it's an important distinction.
Thanks for sharing that. You mentioned that this idea of intelligence diplomacy.
Yeah.
Can you expand on what that is? Because, you talked earlier, or we were talking earlier about how the agency is non-political. So what exactly is intelligence diplomacy? And then how have you seen it work or not work?
That's a great question.
Oh, you go ahead and take that.
So I think we've seen that really burgeon in the last few years, particularly when we had William Burns was the director of CIA, who's a career diplomat and one of the finest diplomats I've ever worked with. Right? He was ambassador in, I think, Amman and also in Moscow, right? Moscow is the big one. And then he held several senior policy level jobs at State Department under different administrations. And then as CIA director, he was, a lot of people kind of labeled him as the shadow Secretary of State because of all the intelligence diplomacy he engaged in. For instance, he was leading the discussions with the Israelis and with the Palestinians from Hamas on the hostage negotiations and ceasefire. And then in Ukraine, which was one of his passionate projects, he was constantly going there to meet with the President Zelensky there. And in fact, prior to the Russian invasion, and yes, Russia did invade Ukraine, prior to the invasion, he met with the Russians, right? Tried to feel them out on it. and engaged in diplomacy there, kind of warning them off it. He also met with the Ukrainians to explain to them that the Russians were coming, because until Russian missiles started impacting on Ukrainian territory, President Zelensky refused to believe it, right? Because he didn't want to believe it. Right? It was just too terrible to comprehend that his country was about to be invaded. But Bill Burns spent a lot of capital and a lot of time, and this was when they presented all kinds of intelligence to show, photographic intelligence of Russian troops on the border, and highly classified signal intelligence intercepts showing them talking about preparing for invasion. Or my favorite one is they warned them and said, hey, they're moving the blood banks to the front. That's a real sign. So intelligence diplomacy has begun to play a bigger role in like the last probably 5-10 years.
So is that kind of like where you're creating credibility with leaders, and then sharing information, and then that helps with
and also, and this is the weird part, kind of, is a lot of our adversaries actually trust the CIA more. They like having a back channel through the CIA. There's kind of even the Cubans at one point really liked that. Mark, you probably
when you think about it, so if you think outside North America and the EU, a lot of countries' foreign policy apparatus is driven by their security organizations, right? So I guarantee you that the security services of Russia are more influential in Putin's decision-making than his Ministry of Foreign Affairs, right? So having the ability to engage with them and from that same capacity on mutually important issues is really important. And to Ralph's point, there's when we're doing intelligence collection or foreign policy, there's the first and foremost thing is U.S. national interest. What's in the interest of the United States? The second thing is what are our aligned interests, right? Whether it's our partners or it's things like, waterway access and mineral rights and space rights. So sometimes that intelligence diplomacy is to get aligned minds around the same factor. So it's using that. And it comes down to this fundamental question of, if you collect secrets and if you collect information, what do you use it for, right? And so it really should be in pursuit of some sort of policy element. And sometimes the things that need to be shared or distributed with partners, allies, and sometimes foes come from clandestine collection, right? And so that's an entire art form of how do you use information that has been clandestinely collected to protect the sources in a way that furthers U.S. foreign policy and security interests. It's a hard game. That's a really tricky part. And that, if you're lucky in the agency, that's what the latter half of your career is wrestling with. The first part is getting the cool stuff, right? It's the Turkish cigarette on the bridge in the fog, talking to some guy named Vladimir, right? Later on, it's like, well, we got this from Vladimir, but how do we tell this without exposing Vladimir, right? That's a really complex problem with a lot of layers, and it takes a lot of touches.
I just had a vision of Cloak and Dagger, the movie, from when I was probably like 6. I don't know if it saw him under the bridge. Anyways, Blake.
Oh, yeah. I mean, intelligence diplomacy, going on that trend a little bit more, I'm worried about this nationalist mentality that seems to be taking over, not just in the U.S., but across the globe. How does that shift the dynamic from an intelligence service as they want to share or withhold information? It seems like it's an issue that we got there.
I'll let Ralph take the meat of this one, but I will say, I will offer, it's really hard to influence any dinner conversation if you're not at the table. So you'll have a hard time convincing me that, interiorizing nationalism and withdrawing from the global stage is in our best national security interests. But it's complicated. So at that point, I'll turn it over to Ralph for his thoughts.
Take this. Tough question here.
Yeah, no, and but a quick segue. When I think about spy movies that reflect our business, I think more of Chevy Chase and Spies Like Us. But The Road to Dushanbe, yes. Look, the thing about intelligence is, and this is where Hollywood really does us a disservice, right? Intelligence is about the truth. It's about facts, right? And when the intelligence community gets in trouble when they don't get the facts right. And, you look at the CIA and our failures are very public failures. Our success is not so public, right? And I would argue that the mere fact that the CIA continues to exist as an institution says we must have gotten a few things right there somewhere along the line, right? The CIA really only has 2 missions. One is recruit human spies, the other is conduct covert action, right? And then with that are the men and women who work in the Directorate of Analysis who do the finished intelligence analysis, right? They're the ones that produce the briefings or the president's daily brief, things like that go downtown to not to make policy, but to help shape policy, right? You have to have policy is based on information. Like we in the CIA, we're very often called upon to go down to Congress and testify, usually in a closed session. And there's always a senator or a congressman or someone there who asks us about policy. And the most fun I can ever have at a briefing is to say, I'm sorry, but I can't speak about policy. That's for State Department, right? And they kind of think, well, that's a cop-out. Well, yes, because it's not my job. My job is to make sure that the agency is gathering the facts, gathering the information that allows other people, elected officials, right? Nobody elected Mark or I, right? We're government employees. We're not elected officials. So policy is not on our docket. And so with intelligence, I agree with Mark. You have to have a seat at the table, but you get that seat at the table by doing things right and getting the information right. And yes, we do have some real blunders out there, some real doozies, right? That happens, and usually there's a policy element. Show me an intelligence failure, and I'll show you a policy failure that goes with it, right? So it's a heavy burden, and it's one we don't always get right, but suffice to say, we do get it right enough to continue to exist.
So can you then now confirm or debunk that CIA was behind the JFK assassination? TBD.
I still haven't read the 80,000 pages they released there, so yeah. But suffice to say, my personal feeling is Washington is so bad at keeping secrets, right? That's a secret that would have gotten out by now.
It would be tough.
Yeah.
It would be tough.
We didn't do it.
At C3, we love C words, and you guys started talking about curiosity in the beginning, and I love the personal story you told about the family. Is there any, I guess, non-sensitive, non-classified kind of story you can tell where you're in a foreign country and things aren't going as planned and you need to pivot and utilize creativity to solve a problem or find your way out of it? Are you filtering through what can be said, what cannot be said?
Trying to find the least embarrassing story.
So I've got one that might work for the occasion, and I think it also I tell this story on occasion in different forums to really show a little bit about operational planning and preparation, right? So it's the idea we have this idea if people are running operations, you're undercover, you're doing things. You're going to be in places that you're not supposed to be or not expected to be. And eventually somebody's going to ask you, what are you doing there? And you got to have a story, got to have a cover story. And the best thing to buttress a cover story is called pocket litter. You got to litter yourself with stuff that you have. So way back when in the area of the Balkans, right, an undisclosed area of Balkans, I'm running around in a place that I definitely should not be doing things that nobody really should know about it. And I'm on a one-lane road in the middle of nowhere. And a car goes past me. That's going to happen. I'm walking I'm mostly done with I'm basically making my way home at this point. And car goes by. I don't think anything of it. It goes up to a main intersection. It turns right. About 5-10 minutes later, I see a convoy of lights coming back the way that car went at me. And so this was back in a time of conflict. There were a lot of peacekeeping and checkpoints and things out there. And this guy pulls up, and it's a military Jeep, and they spotlight me. And I realize very quickly this is a Swedish peacekeeping force. And they're in charge of this area of monitoring activity in there where there'd been some conflict and stuff like that. And so we get some young soldiers that come out. And again, these kids are like 19, 20 years old. They're from Gothenburg, this is all foreign to them. And they're like, what are you doing? So I have some credentials and I have a thing saying, I'm just coming from my friend's house. It is the loosest of stories, right? So I do this or that, and I have this ID and that, it looks legitimate to them. It was a legitimate ID, but they look through all this sort of stuff and they're like, okay. I'm like, great, thanks. They take it, they walk back to the car, they start backing up, they turn around, they go past the other Jeep that was behind them, clearly report in, talk to the window. That they're not, who's ever in that is not buying the story. So they accelerate forward, a bunch of guys get out. Now they've got long guns and they all sort of like point at me because the staff sergeant was like, that story makes no sense at all. So now I get, what are you doing, right? And so if anybody's ever been in the Balkans, they are very prideful, strong-spirited people. And one thing they're super protective of is their young women and their daughters and their spouses. So I realize I've got to go to plan B, but I've got pocket litter. So he's like, what are you doing there? And I'm like, listen, I didn't want to tell anybody, but I met a girl, in the city, and she lives out here, but she's got brothers and a father. And so I parked way back there, and I'm making my way back. So that has some plausibility for it. It's also a little bit interesting. I also have a box of Marlboro Red cigarettes, right? One of the great trading currencies of the world.
It's the Krugerrands of K-Sox. Yeah.
And I have VIP passes to a club from the city, right? And so after several cigarettes, giving up the VIP passes, several reviews of my documents, I got a ride back to my car. So, it is one of those where, I had to be creative. So, I had materials to be there, but I had to read the audience. I was rolling with a bunch of young guys who are as out of place as they are, as I am. So a story that would make sense to them. The women in this area were famously beautiful, very off limits for all the soldiers and everything. So I leaned into that story. I met them where they were. I told them a story that made sense to them, that they loved, and I gave them some cigarettes, and I got to go home.
Oh, that's awesome. How about you, Ralph? Did it come to mind?
Yeah, so one story that I think I like to think about at times, when I was a young case officer and I was chosen to go out on a mission where it was in the Nordic countries, and we had a local couple who had access to an ambassador of a hostile country, and they remarked how this guy would come. They had him over for dinner a lot, and he would sit at their table, and the first thing he would do is pull out this big wad of keys, and he'd check them, and then he'd hang up his coat, and then he'd go in and have dinner and sit down with them. So we decided we wanted his keys. We wanted to make copies of his keys. So myself and another officer, we worked out a plan with his family where they had a Christmas dinner. This was Christmas Eve. Right? We worked out a plan where they were going to have a group of about 20 people they were going to invite, and they were going to set it up in this other room. And then they had this hallway that connected their apartment to a nanny apartment. And they were going to use the hallway to hang up all the coats. And the plan was, when this ambassador came in, they would take his coat, and it would be the first one on the hangers there. So we'd know where it was. And we would be hiding in the closet. And then we had materials to make copies of keys and everything. And we were going to take his keys out, make copies of his keys, put them back in while he's having dinner, and then leave. No one would be the wiser, so that our technicians a couple of months down the road could break into this embassy. So they get the dinner all set up. They get everyone invited. The target ambassador agrees to come and everything. So we go in. We pre-position in the closet a couple hours ahead of time. Very tight space for myself and my very large coworker. And they had forgotten to tell us that they also were going to lock their dog in there. So we also had to share the space with a large Labrador that took a shine to my friend.
Is that so they wouldn't open the closet because the dog's inside?
Yeah. And also because the dog would interrupt the dinner. So we had to keep the dog happy. I remember sneaking into the maid's apartment and stealing like some bologna or something to feed the dog, keep it quiet. So we're in there finally. They would tell us when we would know when the coat was hung up, because they would kind of do a little tap on the door and go to dinner. So we're in there, coats are being hung up, we're hiding way in the back. Finally, we get the little tap. Time to go. We go, sneak up the dog, dropping bologna so the dog will stay in the back. Reach into the pocket of the coat, no keys. Right? So have to abandon. So a couple of days later, we meet with our agents, right, the couple, and we're like, what happened? They said, for the first time, usually the guy comes in, checks his keys, hangs his coat up. This time, he came in, sat down, and put his keys right on the table. So we failed that time. So we did find another way to steal his keys and get into the embassy available. But, that was my Christmas Eve that night, was hiding in a closet with a big burly technical guy and a dog waiting for keys that never showed up.
Love it.
Can you, Mark, I have one for you. There's a playfulness element to espionage. Can you tell the crock pot story?
Oh, yeah. I love that story. I told that story to my parents last night.
I'd forgotten I told that story. So, again, I'm serving in a Russian language speaking place that tends to be hostile to American intelligence officers, and you are under a great likelihood of having your audio monitored, your phone monitored, things like that. So you get used to these practices. You behave a little bit differently than you do today. However, it wasn't easy to get really great meat supplies. And shout out to McDonald's, unpaid sponsor. They did a really nice thing with the embassy that would allow embassy families to order meat beyond burger patties that would come into their distribution shipments. So I made the poor mistake of deciding, and I have a little kid at this point. We're working all day. By the time I get home, she's going to bed after we make dinner. So I decided, I'm going to start using a crock pot. We can have things ready, come home, have more time with the kid. So I do this, and then I make a mistake of sharing on. In order, I order the Mercedes-Benz, the all-clad stainless steel crock pot. If you don't have it, it's a life dream. You should get one. It's amazing. I order this thing. I'm super excited. I get this. I get on the phone. I'm like, I just ordered so much meat. I got 20 pounds of this freezer meat coming. It's great. I'm going to make the chili for the big poker game, right? We're going to get together and play poker. So, I'm using my crock pot. The meat comes, I pick it up, I fill up my freezer. Chili day comes, I go in there, I pull out the crock pot. I can't find the lid. And I'm like, where's the lid? And of course, what did my wife do with the lid, right? And eventually I believe her. She didn't do anything with the lid. The lid's just missing. Well, you know how useful a crock pot without a lid is. It's a huge paperweight. So I have no lid. I have no ability to cook all this meat. So I call and I beg and say, hey, I broke my lid. I just got it. They're like, not a problem. We'll send you another one. It's totally no big deal. I was like, thank you. But now I'm going to be really smart, right? I'm not going to. So I don't really say anything. Ultimately, the lid gets there. Next, chili cook, next poker game, I'm making chili day. I'm all set. Literally that morning, I get up in the morning, I open up, I pull out the crock pot, and I go in, and I have 2 lids. So they were on to me. So they took it because I bragged about my crock pot. And then the minute I ordered another one, they put it back. So I literally carried around 2 lids to the crock pot for like a decade.
Does that instill any fear when something like that happens? It's kind of violating.
It is. Like, listen, we had a dog that we would come home for the weekends and the dog would be in the closet wrapped in a coat, right? Like the dog was definitely more traumatized than we were. You just, in some of these places, they do a good job of preparing you for those challenges of that, what that looks like, how to react. Ultimately, you don't react. So you sort of know it again. It is really important to emphasize you don't feel unsafe in these situations. Ultimately, you're in a foreign country. They have access to almost everything. You sort of have to recognize that. You don't go out of your way to piss them off or annoy them. In real life, you don't speed through a yellow light if you have surveillance. You stop calmly. You never try and escape surveillance, right? If you have surveillance, you don't do anything squirrely. That's just, the risk's not worth the gain kind of thing like that. It is an intrusion. It is uncomfortable. You do spend a couple years with not arguing with your spouse because you don't want people to overhear it. And, there's some upsides to that too. But ultimately, you don't feel physically unsafe. It's just a odd aspect of living.
Well, can we go one deeper real quick on what you just said? Yeah, well, let's pivot it to Ralph to answer it. But we talk about this in the business context a lot, and we are not perfect by any means, but being involved in relationships when unexpected or adversity or really stressful situation hits you, you have to meet it with neutrality and not react negatively or overreact. And that's almost a learned thing, I feel like. The more you're put into high pressure situations, the more you kind of desensitize from it. But when you're first coming into the CIA and you're not exposed to these situations you're describing, how do they prepare you to motor down and not speed through the red light or any of those other things?
Well, I mean, there is training, of course, like when you first come in. Although, for the most part, when people are hired for these jobs, for case officers, there's a lot of psychological profiling, right? Mark and I, I'm sure, share many similar traits, for better or worse, right? You're looking for people, for the most part, who are extroverts, right? People who can deal with ambiguity, people who can solve problems, people who are curious, right? Doesn't mean we're 100% that way, right? There are other people who come through and but there are very common traits there. And so a lot of what we do is not learned, it's kind of innate. And then the training schools will try to bring that out. And then you kind of learn by doing, and you learn it by being overseas. And for us, I like to tell new employees, if you're coming in to be a case officer, it's not a job. This is your life. This is a lifestyle, right? I would tell my officers, look, you're your work doesn't really start when you walk into the office, right? Your work started when you woke up in the morning and when you came to work, right? I would tell my officers, it's okay to be the first one to spot surveillance on you. Don't be the last one, right? When it pops up, when you could be in a country where relations are great and all of a sudden something goes wrong and boom, they come after the intelligence officers, right? So you want people to constantly be aware, but you don't want it to be stressful at the same time, right? Which is a really delicate balancing act between telling people, hey, make sure when you're coming to work or you're going home or you're going to the movies or you're going shopping, you're looking for surveillance, but don't be paranoid and don't be stressed out, right? So there are elements of stress that build there. And what that takes is that's where the camaraderie comes in between the men and women of the CIA, the men and women in a station overseas. They develop an incredible camaraderie. And I always felt sorry for case officers who never took the hard assignments, right? For some reason, maybe they lacked some confidence or maybe they didn't want to go through the extra training for a hard assignment, but they also missed out on this incredible camaraderie that you have. When Hunter S. Thompson said, when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro, right? And overseas for case officers, when the going gets tough, the tough get tougher, right? And people bond together. And it's the only thing I actually really missed from my previous career was that camaraderie of working with people facing the same challenges day in and day out.
I think to your point, like later in your career, it doesn't start there, but yeah, there's a truth to it that the reality is if there was a crisis to hit now, I suspect maybe some others, but Ralph and I our heart rates would go lower. We would slow down. Like we've been here before. We know what it'll take to get through this crisis and do that. But to your point, in the business context, I'll be quite frank and honest here. The first real negative feedback I got in my corporate career joining Starbucks was this was COVID. There was a bit of a crisis, and my phone starts ringing off the hook, and I'm like, wait, what? So I organized this crisis meeting, and the reality is there was no blood on the floor, nobody was at risk, and there might have been a few dollars at stake. That's not a crisis, right? So I very much was so low key that I did sense like, I might have lost the room there a little bit, right? So I get a call from a very senior person who was, that I was supporting. He said, the reality is yeah, for so many people, this is the biggest thing that's happened to them for a few days. And I realized I had to meet them where they were at. Like I'd forgotten to do that a little bit. Like I'm so worried with that crisis hat as things going boom and blood on the ground and getting people safe and lives are in danger. But crisis takes so many forms. So, for me, it was a really good reminder that I have to go back and I have to calibrate. I got to meet people where they're at because they need help and support in crisis management at that time. And you can't be having these arbitrary thresholds of, well, this is important, this is not. So it was a really good reminder of that. And it sort of stuck with me in my corporate career.
Well, to continue that thread of crisis and stress and threats, like as a civilian, we're reading about, all these different threats that the U.S. is facing, whether it's China or Russia or Iran. Do you see like the world as we're having worse than it was before, or there's more threats than there were before, or is it just you think that it's the same kind of thing that just we're getting more of it in our news? And then the second question of this is, who do you think is our biggest threat currently today, to our national security?
Maybe I'll take the softball part of that and then turn the heavy lifting over to Ralph again. Yeah, it's good here. Good. I don't know that the world's more dangerous than it was, but I do think the existential threats are higher than they have been, and that's concern. So for me, and I think this answers your question, right? There's a lot of challenges, right? There's economic competition with China, security threats, there's fentanyl crossing the border, there's all those things. I think Russia represents the one existential threat to the United States national security. It is not a threat to our borders, there's not going to be an incursion, but I think the programmatic plan that Russia would like to pursue continues to deteriorate our national security in a lot of ways. To me, that's the one sort of existential threat that is growing and increasing, and if not dealt with appropriately, can probably 2 and 3x fairly quickly. With that being said, I don't know that it's more dangerous today than it was 25 years ago. Welcome.
No, I totally agree with Mark on that. I think it's just a continuum of misery and trouble out there that, in our business, you get kind of numb to that. We call that Tuesday. You just move from post to post from one day you're dealing with Sunni terrorists in Iraq, and then you're dealing with the Taliban in Afghanistan, or then you're dealing with the French somewhere else, right?
Does that make you jaded?
Yeah, it doesn't make you jaded. I think it makes you less excitable to some way. And when we talk about threats, I agree with Mark. I think Russia is definitely a threat, just because there's a leader there who has a distorted view of history and has a real strong streak of revangism in him, right? I think China's a big threat if she starts to feel like he can take advantage of the United States, right, and get a quick win. There's North Korea, where the little fat guy there has got nukes, and he's, this is a guy who, I remember when he first took over North Korea, everyone's like, oh, well, this would be great because he went to school in Switzerland, which he did, right? And so everyone's like, yeah, maybe he'll be sane. No, he wasn't. Turns out he's not. So there's all these problems out there, but because we deal with them for literally decades, we kind of get numb to it, and we only kind of wake up to it when something happens, like Gaza explodes, or Israel and Iran go tit for tat with missiles. When then all of a sudden all bets are kind of off. That will definitely get my pulse going up. But I think the overall looming danger for America will be ourselves, and that we have to find a way to dialogue with each other, and we have to find a way to deal with these external problems and our internal problems, and not view everything as portending civil war, right? Whatever happened to being allowed to compromise, right? In the past, we had politicians who compromised, and everybody was happy with that. Now, if you suggest a compromise, you're a sellout, right, on one side or the other. And I'll jump on the anti-social media bandwagon that things have become, with the the algorithms that are out there, and the clickbait and all that, where we've left real open, honest, intellectual discourse as roadkill by the side of the road. That, for me, is the biggest danger.
Let's maybe go to you, and then I'm going to wrap up. Last question before we head into rapid fire.
Okay. As you're sharing that last piece, there's this quote by Emerson that you guys have heard me probably say before, but he goes, a problem of restoring the world to original and eternal beauty starts with the redemption of the soul. And the reason that man lies disunited and broken in heaps is because man is disunited with himself. And it's heartwarming to see folks like you, leaders like Jamie and Gabe as well, that are trying to rebuild that unity, because what you are talking about is a division. Where do you see us going forward to rebuild some of that unity?
But that's an easy question.
Yeah, since it's easy, start with you, Ralph.
Please, Barney.
Yoga. Start with yoga.
But it could actually be that simple. I mean, getting people out of nature, for example, finding a way to just get people to together again.
I mean, I'm an optimist, actually. I mean, maybe it's because you just see these sine curves of history, where civilizations rise and fall, disasters and rebirth and all. And I like to think that the United States we still have the capacity to find ways to achieve rebirth. And we'll have some rough times, but I think in the end, Americans have always done what's right. It just sometimes takes us a long time to get there. But I've seen it through the history books, and I've seen it for myself when I've seen Americans overseas who work with such selfless dedication to various causes, or whether it's an 18-year-old Marine Corps private manning a roadblock in Iraq, knowing that the next car that comes up might blow him up, but he's there, right? Or the American missionary who's in Africa tending to the sick who are suffering from Ebola, right? I mean, I've seen Americans across the globe do such incredible stuff. No one knows charity better than Americans. No one practices charity better than Americans, in spite of what so many other countries may view of us. It's just not true when you see it out there. And so I'm a bit more of an optimist, and I think eventually we'll find our way.
Gives you hope.
Yes.
Do you want to comment on it, or are you going to leave it to
I
him?
think we're aligned. I think the thread that of all that, I'm optimistic as well. I think the thread that's concerning to me is there's a bit of a turn that it seems to be, we're sort of anti-science, anti-inform, like it's a bit down on people being really smart or really good at things. And I think that perpetuates a little bit of harm, right? We need really smart people doing really smart things in pursuit of the general community happiness and benevolence, and pulling these things down because they're oppositional to some political perspective or another, I think that harms our ability to be smart in a particularly complex world, right? And things are really hard out there. We need when you have a plumbing problem, you want the smartest plumber possible to do it. And when we have national security and foreign policy issues, we need really smart people who've studied these things or have experience having doing them. And I worry that sometimes we're trying to reduce things so simple to our local considerations that provides widespread challenges. I'm optimistic we'll get through there. I'd like there to be a little less pain and carnage along the way, but
That's not gonna
get yeah.
Well, I like that. You actually use the phrase, it's a common phrase we use at Alder quite often, is civil discourse. And it's like, it's an art that's somewhat been lost in the greater community that we need to find back in a way of having human conversation. But the last question before we shift to rapid fire that I wanted to ask you, because to some extent, we're all in the relationship business, no matter what we do. And so, and maybe the people who are parents can resonate with this even more by using your kid as an example. But you reference the spies out there, and I think you're referring to the people that you have to recruit in the foreign countries where you're at. Can you speak to the strength or weakness of sugar and spice in the recruiting effort? What carries more weight in getting them in, and then what carries the most weight in managing that relationship long term?
So that is a really easy and important question, right? You get way more with sugar than salt. Like the idea of using extortion means to get people to cooperate, whether it's threatening, whether it's things like that, right? Sometimes the sugar can be cash. That makes a difference. But other times, generally, it's allowing people to share their ideas and thoughts and be heard, supporting in that such a way. That's super easy. The thing that comes next is a little bit harder. Sometimes accountability and integrity in that communication and values, right? Like introducing that to a relationship, it's very much, I don't want to trivialize it, but it's like dating and developing a friendship that it starts through commonality. You give each other voice, you give each other agency, and you do things like that. And then there's just responsibilities that go along. There's responsibilities to being a partner. There's responsibilities to being a friend, right? Like, being there at the right time and the right place, communicating, listening when needed. That is part of that journey management of that relationship between people who provide valuable intelligence and their case officer that handles them. But spice, outside the world of counterterrorism, to be honest with you, I don't think there's a whole lot of room for it. Show me an operational plan that's predicated on threatening or hostile, extortive means, and I'll show you one that has a really short shelf life or isn't going to be very good at all.
Well, let's shift to rapid fire. I'm going to have you do the honors of kicking it off rapid fire. Firstly, this is more intended to be fun. Mia made some of them up, I think, based on activities in our life that are going on. So first thought, phrase, whatever that comes to mind, each of you can just take a share if Ralph wants to start.
What's the quickest way to tell someone isn't telling the truth?
The quickest way is to observe them and to listen. All right? And you're looking at their body language, you're looking at their eyes, and you're listening to how nervous they are. You're looking for all those signs. It doesn't always work. There's a cultural bias. All people have a cultural bias, and these are things you learn by meeting with lots of people. And I would have to say the one-word answer would be listening.
Same for you, Mark.
Same question. I am a big proponent of, if you look high and right the first time I ask you something, you're buying a bit of time on that. But it's not foolproof, and it is culturally. There are entire cultures that have whole different physical behaviors. From the simple of Latins gesticulate more or whatever. There's others that don't make eye contact. That would be rude. There's others who. So it's all very loosely.
For countries like Bulgaria, where this means no and this means yes. So you end up going like this when you're talking to each other. Really confused.
I would say there's not a true tried and you get your own experiences and preferences, but there's not tried and true. I don't have a good solution.
As you said that, I moved my head left a little bit. Like, I'm going to go this way.
Being up and away. Yeah.
Okay, what's that? The next one is, what's the coolest gadget you ever got to use? Or was there one as a case officer?
I have to think for a moment about what I can say.
I love helicopters. Okay. they're scary as hell, particularly if you're riding in really old ones maintained by certain third world countries where maintenance is not really respected, but they're always a blast. Love it.
So I might be a little. My favorite gadget is chalk. So
That's a no weird answer.
it is. So
On tech. Answer tech.
Great answer.
it is in the world of espionage. Like it gets very high technical, but ultimately we call it sticks and bricks, and that's the fundamental bit. If I use a piece of chalk to signal it, nobody can track my phone. There's no digital trace. If I do it right, only one person's ever going to notice the chalk mark. So it is the piece of technology that endures. It's used today in its various formats. One of the first operations I ever did involved fish gravel being dumped on a path. Purple fish gravel. If you were walking down a path and there was a pile of purple fish tank gravel on the right, you had a meeting on Tuesday, right? So for me, chalk, which really is emblematic of that, that's my favorite one that I've ever used, and it's the most reliable. Show me technology in an operation, and I'll show you a future breakdown in your operation. Technology always fails.
Love that.
Helicopters fail a lot too.
If we gave you either a microphone right now and asked you to perform, what would you do?
Stand-up comedy.
I would probably tell a story.
You are a good storyteller.
Yeah, so I would tell a story.
All right, we're going to move into the last two questions for Discover the Difference. Gabe will kick us off here.
All right. So this is the fun one when you're looking back on the younger Mark and the younger Ralph, maybe you're 16 or 18, and you're giving them advice on what you know today. What would you say to your younger self?
I would say at times remember to slow down, enjoy it more. I look back at my 35 years, the good days, the bad days. I wouldn't change a single one of them, but there are times I wish I could have savored it more.
That's a really good one. I probably would have appreciated my mullet a little bit more back in the day. It was gorgeous in hindsight. I wish I'd had more of that.
You wouldn't have a tough guy picture.
I didn't. I was really serious about sports, and nowadays I think people are so much smarter on it. I was not. I wish I'd realized earlier I was not going to make a living as an athlete, right? Like I probably spent a little bit too long chasing that dream that could have done other things, but really no regrets other than the hair bit.
Yeah, I think it worked out all right for you.
Not the hair.
Last question, Discover the Difference, is about your differentiating factor. What is that one thing innate in you that has led to your success that you would attribute it to?
Self-awareness, like understanding, and by self-awareness, not by sitting back and thinking how great I am, but self-awareness and like, particularly when you're trying to recruit someone, like, okay, what about me does this person find appealing? What about me is annoying this person? Or what about me is pulling this person into a potential espionage relationship?
Damn, that's good.
You're pretty awesome, though, too. I mean,
That's good. I have thought about this, oddly enough, a little bit. And I think, I don't know if I have a good answer, but I think I'm a very empathetic person, sometimes to a fault. But I think over time, that empathy of really trying to understand where someone's at, right? Even if I have a purpose in that engagement, like I think my amount of empathy, I'm definitely the one that cries at every Olympic backstory, right? Like I can't hide it. My kids mock me. It's there.
you're making my mom cry right now.
But I think part of that has probably helped me over a long time find that frequency and find that tuning that allows me to be helpful, to be a partner, to communicate what's sort of going on and that sort of thing like that. So maybe I would say an excess of empathy at times.
That's awesome. Well, normally this would be part of the podcast where, like, for any audience member who wants to connect with you, here's where to find them and what's next. Being CIA guys, I don't know. Is that something you do or not? Or would you guys prefer to just comment on, like, what are you looking forward to next in life?
Well, so I really appreciate the thoughtfulness, but it's okay, right? I'm sort of retired. My agency time, was wonderful, and I love opportunities to talk about it a bit. I'm currently doing security consulting with the Concentric team, a Seattle-based high-end concierge consulting and security support group. I work with them. I do some consulting on the side. I write the occasional column for the Cipher Brief called Chalk Marks, about the intersection of pop culture and espionage. And
That wasn't a plug, was a chalk, right?
yeah, no, it is some of that. It sort of goes back to that a bit of an idea. So yeah, please find me on LinkedIn or anything else, and I'm happy to engage and meet more people.
So Mark is far more creative than I am, but I do my own consulting. Ukraine is a passionate cause for me, so I try to get out there fairly often, show support. And there's a small chance I might return to government work to help out with some stuff, but I don't know. It's the freedom I've gained in retirement, and frankly, the income is not a bad thing. So it's a big decision, but we'll see.
So to borrow for Dumb and Dumber, you're saying there's a chance. Okay. For the people who haven't picked that up, eventually they will. All right. Hey, big round of applause for Mark and Ralph coming today. Thank you very much.